Helping Christians to understand the Bible. Just a disclaimer to begin with, in case you don't already know, I am not a Christian. I used to be an Anglican priest. I have a PhD in theology, but I no longer believe in God for about 3 decades now. I'm offering these thoughts because biblical literalism is problematic. I thought so when I was a Christian, and I think so now. I think it's a problem for non-Christians and for Christians. It's a problem for society. Some Christians don't know how to read the Bible. They're trapped by their particular Christian community's teaching into believing that the Bible is absolutely inerrant, that it contains no contradictions, no errors at all. As a result of this, when they read the Bible, they're trained to gloss over the obvious errors and contradictions, or even worse, to waste a lot of time and energy finding ways to convince themselves, and I guess other people too, that these errors and contradictions are not errors or contradictions at all. They tie themselves into knots, and sometimes the text too, trying to prove this. They're wasting their time. They're also often missing the most important point about the narrative that they're reading. You don't have to go very far into the Bible to find very blatant and obvious contradictions. I've always known about these since before I was a Christian, after I became a Christian, after I became an Anglican priest, and after I subsequently became an atheist again. These contradictions were never a problem for me, and they don't need to be a problem for other Christians, except that some people make them so by insisting on a literal interpretation of an inerrant Bible. You're making an unnecessary yoke for yourself. I'm not presenting this information as a kind of gotcha moment. See, I told you so. This contradiction, therefore Bible, God, rubbish. There's no need to do that. Okay, so let's go right to the beginning. Yep, the very beginning. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Oh, incidentally, I'm using the New International Version here. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Verse 2 goes on to say, now the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Note that this is actually before the first day. First day, God made light. Human beings, male and female, aren't created until the 6th day. All good so far? There it is then, the very first verse. The narrative then goes on to describe exactly what God, here called Elohim, does on each of the 6 consecutive days until he rests on the 7th day. This is all told in Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 to Genesis chapter 2 verse 3. This account has a highly ritualistic structure. It repeats a number of refrains. And God said, let there be and God saw that was good. It sounds like something from a liturgy. And the word Elohim is used throughout this section for God. This is actually a grammatically plural word meaning gods or deities, but it's usually interpreted as singular in this context. Now let's look at chapter 2. Chapter 2 verse 4. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created, when the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. Now, according to Genesis 1, this took place before the first day. The earth was void and without form. Note also that God is here referred to as the Lord God, which is a translation of Yahweh Elohim. And this is how the following account refers to God all the time. It always uses this term, the Lord God. Verses 5 to 6 then emphasize that there were no plants yet, no rain. Now no shrub had yet appeared on the earth, and no plant had yet sprung up. For the Lord God had not sent rain on the earth, and there was no one to work the ground. And in this context, the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. 2 things to note about this. First, in Genesis chapter 1, Plants are created on day 3, 3 days before mankind is created. Here, man is created before there are any plants. Secondly, there's no mention of woman at this stage. She comes later. Now, this is the first point where biblical literalists come unstuck because they have to find convoluted explanations for why this is not in any way a contradictory account. Oh, and they're very creative at trying to do this, even though it usually involves twisting the text in some way or ignoring other aspects of this story. Then, in this second account, the Lord God makes the garden and plops the man down in it, and that's the first time there are any plants in this story. Then, in verse 18, the Lord God said, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." So, there are no animals. Man is alone. Now, you may recall that in Genesis 1, God created the animals on day 5 and humankind on day 6. Animals before man. It's pretty clear. But for the literalist, contortionist classes are required. In Genesis 2, the Lord God then creates the various animals, trying to find a suitable companion for the man. None of them quite work out, though, so he comes up with the idea of woman, the whole rib thing. So in this second story, woman wasn't actually part of the original plan. She's made after trying out a few other options out of a part of Adam. And we read, "The man said, 'This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called woman,'" which is Isha, "for she was taken out of man, Ish." Interestingly, up until this point, man is referred to as Adam, the general term for human. He only becomes Ish, male, Ish, male, not Ishmael, when Isha, female, is formed. So, there are some fundamental differences between these two accounts of creation. Note that I've used the term differences here rather than contradictions. This is because contradiction is a polemical kind of term, and the concept only arises if you think that these first 2 chapters of Genesis actually constitute a single, supposedly cohesive, story of creation. They don't. There are 2 accounts of creation here, written at different times by 2 different schools, I guess, of Hebrew theology, which was subsequently combined into a single text. Or perhaps one of those schools took an earlier text and incorporated it within its own text. The first version in chapter 1, which sounds so very liturgical and ritualistic, is often referred to in biblical scholarship as the priestly source, or simply P. It's probably quite late, sometime after the Babylonian exile, and it may indeed have been part of a ritual. So it probably dates from somewhere in the 5th or 6th century BCE. The other source, in chapter 2, which is the second account of creation, is the Yahwist or Jahwist source, sometimes called J because of its use of Yahweh as the name of God. This is probably an earlier source, I think. It's more folkloric, more the kind of story you might say around a campfire. Yahweh is depicted in very anthropomorphic terms. He walks in the garden and he chats to the man. So my point here is that you get a much deeper and richer understanding of the Bible when you interpret it as a living document that grew over time, reflecting a number of different points of view at different times in Israel's history. If you tie yourself into knots trying to reconcile these 2 accounts, first of all, you waste a lot of time and energy because you will fail, and you're also missing the subtle nuances and emphases of these different accounts. For instance, they represent 2 very different ways of understanding the interaction between human beings and God. In the first account, God is very remote and formal, which fits with a kind of priestly view that God can only be reached via ritual. But in the second account, God is much more down to earth, quite literally. His relationship with human beings and his creation is much more intimate, much more hands-on, so to speak. Of course, the 2 accounts also provide very different approaches to the relationship between men and women. In the first account, God created men and women together at the same time, both in his image. In the second account, the man is created by God from the dust, but the woman is a kind of adjunct to man. She's derived from him and intended to be a helpmate for him. The two accounts differ not only in the facts that they present, so to speak, but also in their theology. If you're a Christian, you could use this to enrich your beliefs by examining all the nuance and different possible approaches to very difficult questions. On the other hand, if you're a biblical literalist, you will be obliged to smother and deny all this diversity and nuance by forcing it into a single monolithic belief system. And I think we see the catastrophic effects of this in contemporary evangelical Christianity. Sameness good, difference bad.